I am the revelation of humanity, for I have not yet sown a seed. There is no love. And what is true human love? With love, let the little angels come into this world.
Hello everyone, how are you? Sean, welcome back. Today we'll cover a case you've requested often, especially ones from Latin America. So today we're going to talk about a killer who was sadly notorious because of the number of deaths he caused, the number of crimes he was accused of, and that were also proven. This is one of those really intense cases, so trust me on that. If you are easily impressed, skip this one, don't watch it. Today we're going to talk about the case of Pedro Alonso Lopez, better known as the Monster of the Andes. Before we start, let me mention your 10 seconds here, where YouTubers, Instagrammers, and Twitch streamers promote themselves. Today's 10 seconds are for lore. Martel Lore is a photographer who specializes in capturing images related to occultism, the supernatural, and horror. In her photographs and compositions, she explores themes such as the deconstruction of beauty, suffering, and hopelessness. I'll leave her Instagram account in the description so you can check out her work and follow her. Besides that, I want to let you know that on this channel we have a membership that allows people who join to watch these kinds of very intense videos. No censorship, no ads, 24 hours early. To watch this and other cases, click the join button below, select membership to Dark Master, and visit the community tab. Now then, without further ado, let's begin with today's case. Pedro Alonso Lopez was born on October 8, 1948 in Ipiales, Nariño, Colombia, although other sources say it was in the department of Tolima. His father, Medardo Reyes, was a member of the Conservative Party of Colombia and died as a victim of a shooting during the Civil War at that time. Pedro Alonso Lopez would be born 6 months later. That same year, Colombia went through the period known as La Violencia. This era bears this not-so-subtle title because of the assassination of the liberal politician Jorge Eliezer Gaitan, who after being shot several times died from his fatal wounds at the Central Clinic. After this, civil war broke out in the country and a bloody period of violence began, lasting for 10 years and taking more than 200,000 lives. The violence was a combination of many political, social, economic, and religious crimes. This is why Pedro Alonso Lopez spent his early years surrounded by one of the worst environments to grow up in.
My future has always seemed unbalanced, maybe even forgotten by society, right?
But before we get into his story, let's learn about the roots of the Monster of the Andes. Pedro Alonso Lopez lived in a house where loneliness was not an option. He was the 7th of 13 siblings, and the violent environment of his home, if you can call it that, was made even worse by the violence caused by his large family. But above all, by the clients brought by his mother, Benilda Lopez. But what was a prostitute? It should be clarified that Pedro and his 12 siblings are the result of Benilda's various sexual relationships with her clients. With only a curtain as separation, the 13 siblings slept in the same room where their mother prostituted herself. Near the end of his life, he would recount how he remembered the moans and the smells that left deep marks on his thoughts as an adult. Pedro's childhood was not easy at all. Difficulties growing up and violence were commonplace. His mother's dominance and tyranny were considered normal at home. The neighbors of the Lopez family said that you could hear the mistreatment of the children.
I asked the mom, "Why are you doing that?" She said, "I'm looking at the devil."
She is Benilda Lopez, Pedro Alonso's mother. Here she is remembered for the violence against her children. For many, she not only brought an introverted boy into the world, but also gave birth to the monster.
It wasn't a normal upbringing from a mother because she hit them a lot. She would beat them with broomsticks, throw them against the wall.
Yes, that's true. She was very harsh with him.
Bush, it was too much. She really hit him. Benilda.
She hurt Pedro by hitting him with a broom whenever she could. With forced sexual teachings, Pedro tried to rape one of his little sisters, and his mother caught him just before the boy could do it. The next day, she threw him out of the house, but not before burning his feet with a lit candle. This happened when he was only 9 years old. That's how Pedro had to seek refuge on the streets, a place where the cold and cruelty fed his first years of loneliness in 1912. On the streets of Colombia, danger lurked around every corner, and that was the path that led him to explore neighborhoods he had never been to before, where he encountered his first atrocious experiences. During the first weeks of his exile, he received help from a kind old man who offered him food, shelter, and a roof to sleep under. Pedro accepted and welcomed the show of affection he so desperately needed, but he let his guard down. The benevolent gesture of that old man would create the deepest wound in Pedro's life. The man beat him, took his clothes off, raped him repeatedly, and forced him to stay locked up there. He was tied up in a room far from the house, and every so often the man would sodomize him with a frequency that his small body could barely endure. Finally, he had to let Pedro go and allow him to leave. Those sexual assaults continued to shape his character, making him increasingly rough and full of resentment. Back on the street again at the same age but with a heavy experience on his shoulders, he had to survive as a vagabond. Knife fights with other homeless people became a routine. On top of that, he learned to smoke bazuco, which is the base paste of cocaine, a drug very similar to crack. This troubled boy would sneak into abandoned buildings and houses to feed himself with whatever he could find in the trash. Pedro Alonso Lopez was 10 years old then. During one of his aimless wanderings, he headed toward the highway and was picked up by a motorist who took him all the way to a big city. Without knowing it, Pedro had arrived in Bogota. Different city, but the same fate. He kept wandering until an American found him lying in the street. Dirty and hungry, the American took pity on his situation and brought him home to give him shelter. As a reflex, Pedro doubted the good intentions of this man, and during the trip to his house, he was cautious, an unusual attention for the American, who years later would provide this information to international authorities. When they arrived at what would be her new home, she found what she had always wanted, a real family that would give her her first happy years. During the next 2 years, Pedro learned that he could be happy. His life was moving forward. He even went to school. His new normal. Friends, family, home, and studying had gotten him used to something he was not meant for. One of his teachers at school sexually abused him, with fear once again. Like an ally, he stole money from the school office and returned to the streets. Colombia began its restructuring at that time. At the end of the Civil War, factories began to reopen and order returned to the country. It wasn't a quick process, but for people with low incomes, it was a breath of fresh air and a new hope. Pedro by that time was still living on the streets, but noticing this improvement in the country, he tried to enter the workforce and thus looked for his first job. The new hopes and his possible social reintegration faded away after receiving constant rejections. The fact that he had no experience made him take a new path. The street and his needs forced him to learn how to survive, now a bit less subtle. Searching for food in the trash and abandoned houses turned into criminal acts that involved other people. Was crime his only way of life? He learned to steal, focusing mainly on car theft. And for several years, he kept that label. Later on, it would become just a subtle memory of his story. With his street experience, he quickly became a skilled thief, becoming the focus of admiration for other apprentices. But in 1969, when he was 18 years old, he was arrested and sentenced to 7 years in prison. He became highly sought after by the people who controlled the dirty business in Bogota. After just a few days behind bars, Pedro became the sexual toy of other inmates. He knew how to wait, and he was no longer a helpless child. Amid all the emotional burden, the mistreatment, and his hot temper, it led him to an emotional outburst. One day, he decided to put an end to all of this and finally start his revenge. The young man got a knife and slit the throats of each of his attackers one by one. Pedro realized for the first time the pleasure that killing gave him. Slitting the throats of those 3 inmates opened the door to a completely dark place where he would enter, but he would also take many innocent people with him. His actions were judged as self-defense and his sentence was only increased by 2 years. In his mind, 3 important things were still going around: the hatred towards his mother, the objectification of women due to excessive consumption of pornography, and the uncontrollable delight. When it came to killing, these events deeply affected him. His attitude changed dramatically after his first kill. Something had broken inside him. Investigating the first statements, he said that after his revenge, the seed of darkness that had been planted inside him since he was very young.
I am the revelation of humanity. As I haven't created a seed, there is no love. What might true human love be? A love for the little angels to come into this world?
It had sprouted into a growing power. The fears that once embraced him had now disappeared, and that had produced an addictive intoxication in him. By then, the decision had been made. No one would abuse him again. From now on, he'd just take what he wanted. No matter if, to satisfy his wild desires, he had to kidnap, kill, or abuse others. Pedro, because of the abuse and abandonment by his mother, had developed a fear of women. Since he was a child, he was unable to communicate with them normally. The only contact, somewhat distant, was when he spent hours looking at porn magazines. The closeness he thought he gained with these images actually drove him further away from his need for women. He later said that in his mind, he blamed himself for all the suffering in his life and the pain in his heart. He left prison and Colombia in 1978. He began to travel through every corner of southern Peru until he reached an area controlled by the Ayacuchos, a local ethnic group. There, Pedro Alonso Lopez seized his opportunity. He stalked the girls who wandered alone along the remote paths. Initially, he selected only from indigenous villages, mostly in the most remote areas. Once the abduction was done, he attacked the girls. He beat them, raped them, and ended their lives by strangling them while staring into their eyes. Then he proceeded to bury the bodies in graves he dug himself, which often contained several bodies. Years later, in his own words, he explained what was going through his mind. I always looked for the girls with the most innocent eyes. Do you...
Like candy? Yes, I have more candy nearby.
Another peculiarity of his murders was that these crimes had to be committed in broad daylight. In later statements, he described what seemed to be his own ritual. He forced the girls to have sex with him and put his hands around their throats. When the sun came up, he strangled them. It was only good if he could see their eyes. I never killed anyone at night. It would have been a total waste in the dark. I had to see them in the daylight. There was a divine moment when I put my hands around her neck and watched the light fade from her eyes. Only those who kill know what I mean, he confessed years later. In just under a year, more than 100 girls from the local groups were violently attacked by Pedro.
But before that, it was a terrible family tragedy and a collective psychosis. Knowing that a 4th grade girl from the Ecuador center in this city had been murdered by this criminal, when I deeply felt my pain, I wrote her a letter that said, "Letter to Heaven." I wrote.
The police ignored the complaints of the indigenous people. By that time, the issue of human trafficking was something that was getting all the news coverage. With so many parents searching for their daughters, it was assumed the girls had been kidnapped by local prostitution or slavery networks. From 1978 to 1980, more girls disappeared, mostly in Colombia and Ecuador. This was a fact the police used in response to the complaints, without knowing that it was hiding the work of a serial killer. Pedro, working within trafficking cartels, killed nearly 100 girls aged 9 to 12. This earned him the nickname the Monster of the Andes. After raping, strangling, and killing these young victims, he even engaged in necrophilia, with the lifeless bodies, some of them still bearing traces of dirt and stones. Many times, the urge was so strong that he had to dig up the bodies he had hidden on the outskirts of Peru. He never kidnapped or killed white girls because he said their parents watched them too closely. He clarified this to the authorities. From there, and the national team, he always stalked the youngest girls from the indigenous tribes. Me.
Supposedly for statutory rape of minors. They haven't caught me, caught in the act. I'm being prosecuted as a mitigating factor. It was my duty to take the police there. The abuse of corpses by the justice system and society goes unpunished.
Did you commit all those crimes?
I participated in the act at someone else's suggestion representing Jorge Patino.
In how many?
Of Ecuadorian nationality, I'm Colombian.
How many crimes were you involved in?
I participated in about 4.
Did you kill anyone?
They taught me, but I didn't like it.
What message can help prevent these crimes in society?
Well, during the time I've been incarcerated, I've been a normal person and I've always had a good reputation. That's according to the opinion of other inmates and the prison staff. And I should also clarify that I've been a victim of prejudice from the media, which has exaggerated things beyond what they really are.
Law enforcement officers weren't concerned about events inside the local indigenous communities. This gave Pedro free rein to keep satisfying his murderous urges. Without worrying too much about the police, he continued raping, killing, and burying little girls with impunity. The legend of the girl hunter grew among the superstitious indigenous people, and the monster not only fed his appetite for blood, but also grew as a local legend. This excessive freedom would have its first setback in the north of Peru. Pedro was captured when he tried to kidnap a 9-year-old girl who escaped death. Thanks to several members of Hayao Yacuchos who chased him, they had actually been suspicious of him for some time. The indigenous people tortured him for days and went to the extreme. They buried him up to his head and used their indigenous background to carry out vigilante justice. They covered him in honey so ants would eat him. Pedro went on to recount what had been one of the worst moments of his life for him. The Indians in Peru had tied me up and buried me in the sand up to my neck. They buried me because of what I did to their daughters. They had covered me with honey and were going to leave me to be devoured by ants. But an American missionary lady came in her jeep and promised them that she would turn me into the police. As he says in his story, he was lucky that an American missionary appeared who worked for the social reintegration of the Ayacuchos. She was able to convince the indigenous people to let her take Pedro to hand him over to the authorities. Once Pedro was saved, she let him go. That is one of the versions, since there is another one that confirms he was taken to the Peruvian authorities and was immediately set in motion to be deported to his country. But it was during that trip that the monster managed to escape. Pedro continued leaving traces of death in Peru, Colombia, and Ecuador. He no longer followed a pattern, but rather an obsession to possess every girl he liked. Always keeping his victims between 8 and 12 years old, he used a simple modus operandi. He lured them with small gifts and took them to secluded places where he carried out his monstrous ritual. Always the same goal, death. Back in 1980, in Ambato, Ecuador, a major flood led to the accidental discovery of one of Pedro's graves. In that tragedy, more than 100 people went missing, and when rescuers found the bodies of 4 girls, they checked them against the records of missing persons. That's how, thanks to a natural disaster, the pieces started coming together that would put Pedro behind bars. The police then started a formal investigation, but as expected, all their inquiries led nowhere. The water had erased the traces of the crimes and all chances of finding a suspect. They had no leads, not even the slightest idea of who could be behind all these murders. But did they know that someone had hidden all these bodies? Days later, Pedro made one of his worst mistakes, a mistake that took him to the police station. He was caught while trying to kidnap a 12-year-old girl in the parking lot of a supermarket. The mother, Maria Poveda, when she saw what was happening, could only scream and ask for help when she realized what was going on. The local shopkeepers acted quickly and held Pedro until the authorities arrived. Connecting that kidnapping with the 4 bodies was a matter of hours. Pedro was very calm when the officers arrived at the scene. He was speaking incoherently and rambling. After taking him to the police station and interrogating him, their suspects were not as they had imagined. Their first conclusion was that they had a madman who was not in his right mind.
A little while later, one of my co-workers comes and says, "Mrs. Carlina, do you know that a man tried to take my daughter by giving her 10 sucres?" I chased him all through the plaza, down Salinas Street and Olmedo Street. And I told a gentleman who is an acquaintance, I told him to help me catch that man because he's starting to lure the girls. But on Zavala Street, yes, we already caught him and brought him closer to Urbina, to my port in Tabasco.
Lopez refused to cooperate with the authorities and remained silent.
I myself am to blame for declaring myself, let's say, always in favor of society and justice, declaring myself, let's say, as self-guilty, because I have a part of guilt and I have a part of being innocent of the events.
Then, Pedro adopted an attitude of absolute silence in response to the questions asked during a lengthy interrogation. Faced with this new obstacle, the police had to be shrewd and careful, since at that time Pedro was only a suspect of having committed murder and was not formally a murderer. In order to confirm that guilty status, of which they were almost 100% sure, they had to get him to open up and tell the police all the information he had. They immediately ruled out that intimidation was not the best option. Pedro neither confirmed nor denied the disappearances, the murders, or the attempted kidnapping. The only resource the investigators could think of, given the Catholic faith professed by the detainee, was to bring in a priest. They called Father Cordoba Agudino, whom he had met and spoken with in prison. The police's strategy was for Father Agudino to gain the suspect's trust so that he would confess to his crimes. In just a few hours, he managed to turn this suspect into one of the most important serial killers in history. Pedro confessed and revealed such repugnant acts of violence to the priest that he couldn't listen anymore and asked to please be taken out of there.
He decided, because they are more docile and easier to deceive. The girls from Colombia are prettier, but they are very suspicious of strangers. Although I did manage to kill some of them. Thanks so much. They should reward me for that.
He confessed to me such horrible, brutal, and violent acts that I couldn't keep listening to him, said the priest, greatly perplexed after hearing the suspect's story. First, he raped the girls and then strangled them, staring them straight in the eyes. Because at that moment, the sexual excitement and pleasure reached their peak just before their life faded away.
The force this guy used would break their vertebrae right here. And they found the torso, but as for the head, they don't know.
Was found. In his confession, Pedro blamed his crimes on a difficult childhood and adolescence. I lost my innocence at the age of 8, so I decided to do the same to as many young girls as I could. The brief interviews with Father Gudino provided investigators with strong evidence against Pedro regarding the recent evidence of murders and abuse. The monster had confessed to the crimes of at least 110 girls in Ecuador, 100 in Colombia, and more than 100 in Peru. Pedro always talked about them as if they were women and not just girls. When he was asked how he selected his victims, how did he convince them before committing his crimes? Pedro explained that he often looked for his targets with a childlike look that showed the greatest innocence. Another of his atrocious statements was that he mainly preferred Ecuadorian women because they are more docile, more trusting, and more innocent. They're not like Colombian girls who are suspicious of strangers. Once they were dead, he would dig graves and bury them in groups of 3 or 4 so he could visit them later and have them all closer together. Those girls were his little dolls, as he called them himself, and talking to them became a celebration that later turned into necrophilic pleasures. Necrophiles.
Restrain yourself. I'm in. He tried hard.
However, he clarified, since they couldn't move, I got bored and went to look for new girls. This would mark him forever as one of the most ruthless serial killers in America. The American journalist Ron Leitner had managed to do a report on Pedro Alonso Lopez, and in it, he provided chilling details about his murders. In those interviews, he said atrocious things, like, for example, that these crimes were like eating chicken. Why eat old chicken when you can eat young chicken, said the monster. The moment of death is thrilling and exciting. Someday, when I'm free, I'll feel that pleasure again. I'll be delighted to kill again. That is my mission. There is a wonderful moment, a magical moment, when I have my hands around the neck of these girls. That's where I feel alive. The man of the century, no one will be able to forget me. The phrase, I am the man of the century, no one will be able to forget me, was repeated on all the news programs, finally giving him the fame he had always sought.
Did you used to keep a file of the girls' names? No.
No, nothing like a file. Just some notes where my partner in crime, my partner in adventure, he used to show me them. The violations he committed, so I wouldn't forget those places where I made some notes. And that helped me to give a better investigation to the facts, to the violation of the facts by what is available.
How did he bury the bodies after committing the act?
That was left without that stake.
How is that?
Just like when a moving animal dies, right?
Did they cover it with straw?
That's what I did. Look, I tell you more.
Maybe. And to tell him about the situation, if maybe the person was chosen or the person who showed up.
As you said, that person showed up.
What did they tell you?
I didn't know about statutory rape or the depravity. I learned. I have remorse, regret, and awareness. What I did, but not alone. They taught me, especially the one who teaches me. Bruce, since I didn't agree with the sacrifice, I feel forced because of intense pain to take justice into my own hands. During those 4 days, I had killed Jorge Patiño. That's when, if I tell the authorities, I become an informant about what happened, right? The rest already comes, let's say, from so much publicity.
Pedro took the police to the places where he had buried his victims. In one of these graves, they unearthed 53 bodies of girls. The police went through around 30 graves. In some of them, only a few remains were found. These disappearances were attributed to the actions of the area's natural predators. Not all the murders could be proven. But as the director of prison affairs, Vencedor Lascano, mentioned, if someone confesses to being the author of hundreds of murders, and more than 57 bodies are found in a pit, should we believe what he says? I think his estimate of 300 victims is very low. In 1980, Pedro Alonso Lopez was sentenced to life in prison for his crimes and would spend the rest of his life in jail. But as with many serial killers, this did not happen.
One last question. Where is the person who made him commit those crimes? Where? Where does your sidekick live? Here?
Goodbye, Doctor. And don't worry about those papers I gave you. They're letting me go tomorrow.
In 1999, he was paroled from the Ecuador prison. The inexplicable thing about this decision is that Colombia and Peru did not request his extradition so they could try him there. The crimes committed in these countries went unpunished. There were more than 200 murders of girls that the authorities decided not to punish. His release was filmed by television, and it was crazy to see Pedro come out and shout his thanks to God.
Gentlemen, I'm leaving.
Goodbye. Several mothers challenged his release.
If anything happened to my daughter, I would have killed him. What do you think? No, that's dangerous. But now...
He served 14 years, but...
He hasn't
changed at all. The monster laughed and carried his things in a plastic bag. He looked like a happy man.
He was only free for about an hour. Because he was a foreigner and undocumented, he couldn't go back to his country. The chief of police of Pichincha brought new charges against him to deport him and ordered his return to prison.
You're a foreigner, and without proper documents, I can't release you.
When they put him in a police truck to transfer him, a crowd was waiting outside to attack him. They threw stones at him, among other things, but the officers saved him from the lynching that people were ready to carry out. The victims' relatives were crying out for revenge. The legal status of the authorities was simplified to him, continuing to receive psychiatric treatment and reporting to the judiciary every month. But as expected, Pedro Alonso Lopez never reported. How many
rapes did Pedro Alonso actually commit?
I didn't commit them. I'm accused as an accomplice. I was involved, but he accuses
Jorge Patiño of being the direct perpetrator of the rapes. But apparently this person is his own invention, or... Did you kill him?
Yes, because he had me under threat of death, that if I turned him in, he would kill me. But Jorge...
Patiño, is that you? He said no, father.
I am Pedro Alonso Lopez, at your service.
Instead of that, the monster traveled to Espinal to meet with his family, especially with the person he had blamed for all the pain in his heart. His mother, Mrs. Benilda Lopez Castañeda, a woman who had once begged them not to release him because he might go and kill her. Lopez was relatively compassionate with her and did not harm the old woman at all. With the fervent faith of someone recently released from prison, he spoke only of blessings and the path to redemption.
Did he write anything else?
Yes.
Yes, poems.
It's what I like the most. I have one dedicated to a very special person.
Today you arrived again before dawn bloomed, and a strange sadness surprised you in your gaze. Something you wanted to tell me as bad news, but the day entered us and you didn't say anything to me.
By avoiding violence, Lopez had truly gone to settle accounts, and the way he did it was by demanding his mother sell some of her belongings to give him some help. With that money, Lopez left and nothing was heard from him again until October of 2002. Colombia issued a search and arrest request to Interpol since they suspected that it was Pedro Alonso Lopez who was behind a recent murder in El Espinal. The victims' families kept what they had offered when the killer went to prison, a reward of $25,000 to whoever would finish him, whether inside or outside of prison. Speculation about his disappearance surfaced quickly. There was speculation about his whereabouts, although the most logical suspicion was that he had been killed by a bounty hunter or by a relative of one of his many victims. It is presumed that he was executed illegally, as with every dark legend from time to time. There are still reports of people who claim to have seen the monster of the Andes in the mountains of Ecuador or Colombia. Today his name is used to scare little girls, something terrible for the mental health of young children. His mother, Benilda Lopez, is certain he is still alive. According to her, whenever someone close to her has died, their spirit has revealed itself to her, which hasn't happened with Pedro. In 1998, before regaining his freedom, Pedro emphasized these words to the Colombian authorities. The moment
of death is fascinating and
exciting.
Someday when I'm free again, I'll feel that moment again. The moment. I'll be glad I'll kill you again. It's my mission.
The reality of his crimes will always prevail in the memories and in the history of the families shattered by these murders, especially among people in these three countries. And that's the story of the monster of the Andes, a terrible, terrible story, one of the hardest I've had to tell on this channel. Not only because of the number of crimes against little girls attributed to him, but also because he described all these crimes with complete coldness. He didn't feel anything, no empathy, he didn't feel any remorse for these terrible murders. And what caught my attention the most about this particular case is that currently Pedro's whereabouts are unknown. Some say he was executed, but it could be that he's still free, still roaming the mountains, still living somewhere in the hills, hidden in some jungle. This really scares me personally, even though I'm thousands and thousands of kilometers away from where he used to attack. Hopefully one day they'll find him. Hopefully the remains of Pedro, the remains of the monster of the Andes will be found, and this story can finally come to an end, and people can live in peace again, and they can let their daughters go out on the street without fear of being kidnapped. What?
Guarantees that Pedro Lopez, after being in his country, in Colombia, won't go back to his old ways.
Sir, more than one journalist has pointed that out to me. And it's absurd to think that I would be so naive or so ignorant as to go and do what happened 15 years ago.
That's the story for today, the story of the monster of the Andes. I hope you found this case so cruel and so terrible interesting. If you found it interesting, please subscribe, like, and turn on notifications. Watch this and other cases uncensored, ad-free, 24 hours early. Just click the join button below, select membership number 2 Maestro Oscuro, and visit the community tab. My name is Magnus Mephisto. We will surely see each other in the next video. If you want to keep watching videos, I'll leave a selection here so you can choose the ones that interest you the most.
Despite what the specialists say, 46 innocent girls' lives were taken by a psychopath. Thank you, we let the wolf loose. When he turned 45 years old with a whole life ahead of him to kill, to rape. And thank you, subscribe to the channel, subscribe.